Okay, we will be going to our next presenter, Alma Swan, who you can see up on the screen here now. Let me just make a few announcements before we get started again. You now have on your tables evaluation forms. If you could grab one and before the end of the day, just complete the form with any comments that you might have. We're very eager to, as always, to get feedback on these symposia for the long-term series. And as we start, we are actually beginning to plan next year's symposium now. And we would very much like to hear any of your comments and thoughts about the presentations, all of the different questions that are there on the forms. And you can just leave those on the table at the end of the day. We will have a series of presenters over the afternoon, starting with Alma Swan. And as you can see, we're doing something a little bit different. Alma is in the United Kingdom and is joining us through video conference today. And it's my great pleasure to introduce her. I've heard Alma speak on many occasions and been very, very impressed with her perspectives on open access. She is a major asset to the field in terms of the reporting and analysis she has done of the open access movement. She is one of the directors, one of the principals of a company by the name of Key Perspectives Limited that has done a great deal of analysis in support of the open access movement over the years, and has especially been represented in planning activities in the United Kingdom. She holds honorary academic positions in the University of Southampton School of Electronics and Computer Science and the University of Warwick Business School. She is the convener of the Enabling Open Scholarship Group, a global organization of universities that are promoting the principles of open access and open scholarship in the academic community. She's done a great deal of market research around the topics associated with open access, business modeling of open access efforts, and the study and promotion of new forms of scholarly communication in the digital age. She writes and makes frequent presentations on scholarly communication issues, and as I was working with Bill Moen and others on the preparations for this conference, Alma was one of the first people that I decided I really wanted to have represented at this conference, because I know of no one that can give a better perspective on the big picture on open access than her. So we are going to have Alma first speak to us a bit just on the video here, and then she will go to presentation slides, and hopefully all of the technology will cooperate as it did in our tests in preparation for this event. We'll hope that all the network gods smile on us today. So please join me in welcoming Alma Swan.
Thank you. Martin, shall I just go? Okay.
Yes.
All right. All right. And I take it that everybody can hear me here. So you're just going to see my face for this 10 seconds or so, and then I am going to show you my computer screen on which I have my presentation ready. I want to just say that the title of my talk today for you is The Economics of Open Access. And Martin allowed me to choose what I was going to speak on. And I chose to speak on this because quite a lot of work is now being done on that at various levels, which I'm going to describe to you during the course of my talk, including something that we have just completed and has just been published in Europe, which I think you might be interested in. And I think this is an area where there is going to be a good deal more work. And the reason that I particularly think it will be of interest to you today is that it does help. This evidence that is building up in this area of economics is helpful in making a case in your institution for open access. I imagine that most of you are representing libraries from the region. And of course, you are trying to make the case within your university for having a policy about open access. And really nothing speaks better than an argument which is based on economic advantage. And so that's why I chose this as my topic for you today. So, as Martin said, technology willing, I am now that's the end of me, you're going to see until we get to the questions and answers. And I'm going to switch you now to look at my computer screen. I have closed down my email program and closed down all the other things that I don't want you to see. And all that there is now on my screen is my PowerPoint presentation. So here we go. This may just take a couple of seconds. Okay, so you can see yourselves there now, and I'm going to move you out of the way. And
Alma, we are not quite seeing your slides yet.
Okay, no, well, it may just, okay, there you go.
Okay, something's happening now.
You've got it. So you can see yourselves there.
Yeah.
This is like one of those things, those mirrors that see mirrors. Anyway, you're going out of the way here for now. And here's my show. So we're going to look at the show itself. So hopefully you can still hear me. Martin, if you can't hear me, please shout and I'll try to do something about it.
Yes, we still hear you. We still hear you. Yep. And can you maximize the view of the slide?
It is maximized on my screen.
Okay.
It's got my
okay, that's our okay, we're fixing it on our end.
There?
Yes, well, now we have it. Please go ahead.
Okay, good. So you've got my title slide up there. Good. Okay, so the economics of open access, I've said enough about that. I'm going to move on to the first slide now. So what sort of economics am I going to be talking to you about today? I'm going to talk about the economics of different types of open access. So that means the green route to open access, which, as you all know, means through putting copies of published papers into institutional repositories or central repositories, if there is one. Or there's the gold route, which is through open access journals, which usually, and actually don't usually, but our scenario which we're modeling is focused on journals which charge article processing fees to authors who wish to publish in those journals. So there's the different types of open access which can be modeled economically. We can do the modeling at a national level, and we can do it at an institutional level. And we can also look at beneficiaries which are outside the normal range of beneficiaries that we normally talk about, which is other people within the academic research community. We have just done a project which is looking at one particular constituency, a beneficiary outside the academic research community. And I think that this is very important work, and hopefully there will be some more done like that. So just to give you a quick run through now of the studies to date that have been done on the economics of open access. And I hope that this talk, the slides from this talk, will act as a kind of resource for you afterwards if you're interested in this topic, because I've tried to summarize what has been going on right up to the present day. First of all, there have been studies done at a national level trying to answer the question, will open access be cheaper? Whichever way we get to it, will it be a cheaper system of scholarly communication than the current one, which is based on subscriptions, and for those who don't have subscription access, paying for access via individual transaction fees for particular articles. Now, the first study that was done on this was done by CEPA, that's our Cambridge Economic Associates, Publishing Associates here in the UK. Based in Cambridge, they did this 2 or 3 years ago now, and their work was to identify the costs of scholarly communication, the publishing system, both in the UK and worldwide, and they also looked at how the cash flows around that system. Who is putting the cash in? and where is it going at different points in the system. The second study that came along shortly after that, well, actually, some had been done earlier, as you can see there, in 2006. They were the Australian studies. But then in the UK in 2009, John Houghton and his colleagues from the University of Victoria in Melbourne in Australia did a big study here in the UK and then followed it up in two other European countries and then in the US, looking again at the costs and cash flows, but they added on something else in their study. They didn't just look at where the money is and where it's going. They also calculated the value of the efficiencies in the system that will come from open access. And I have a slide on this, and I should just talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. But these studies have been done first in Australia and then replicated in these other countries that you can see up there on the slide. CEPA was then commissioned again in last year and have just published a study looking at, again, the costs of open access, but then calculating the cost benefit of open access. So here we are again. We're moving forward from just looking at the costs of the system and what we might save in pure monetary terms to looking at the benefits, and they come from the efficiencies of open access. And as I said, I will explain what I mean by that in a moment. So they were the national level studies, the big national level studies that have been done to date. And then they were followed on by some at institutional level. There have been a number, and I have not listed them here because there have been several, studies which have simply compared the cost of gold open access. That is, if your university, all the researchers in your university were paying one-off article processing fees every time they wanted to publish an article in an open access journal, that cost has been compared with the cost of subscriptions to your library. And there have been a number of studies doing that for individual institutions like Yale or whatever. And just looking at that simple comparison, it's quite helpful, but it's not really getting to the crux of the matter, because open access brings efficiencies which this kind of study does not take into account. And the other study, which I shall be giving you some data from, is the one that we did ourselves, and well, I did actually, and there we were modelling the costs and benefits using the model that John Houghton developed for individual universities in the United Kingdom. And I hope that you're going to be interested in the results from that, because you can use this model to do exactly the same thing for your own universities there in the United States. And then finally, there's a very recent report that only actually published on Monday or Tuesday of this week, and that is of the economic impact of open access outside the research higher education sector. So I'll be finishing off telling you a little bit about that one. So there's all these different levels, there's all these different constituencies that can benefit from open access, and we need to look at what the economic benefits are. Now, here I'm going to tell you about these efficiency benefits that we assume are going to come from open access. First of all, there will be an obvious direct cost saving. Your library will save money on subscriptions, it will save money on paying for interlibrary loan and pay-per-view charges for buying access to individual articles if you don't have the subscription from it. So that's a simple thing. And then we come to the kind of efficiency thing, which is that open access makes it easier for authors to find and retrieve the material that they need to do various things. First of all, to read articles, because they're trying to keep up with what's going on in their field. Secondly, they need to read papers if they're going to, and read articles if they're going to write papers of their own. So when it comes to the time for writing a paper, then they're scurrying around looking for background literature to cite and to make sure that they've covered all the context that they need to in writing their paper. And when they are asked to peer review a journal article or a book chapter, then of course they should be, if they're doing that conscientiously, they should be looking for the papers that are cited at the end of that article, making sure they're familiar with that. That gives them the context for deciding whether the article should be published or not. So open access is going to simplify and make more efficient all those processes that an author has to carry out in the course of his or her work. It also takes away the need to spend time dealing with permissions and copyright issues. Authors who want to use a graph from somebody else's paper or a table of data from somebody else's paper in a paper of their own, or even a photograph, need to ask publishers for permission to do that. Sometimes they even need to do that if they want to use material from their own papers. And we all think that's crazy, but nevertheless, it does happen. And this all takes time. Publishers take time to respond, and then there may be some ongoing correspondence that's needed. So that can all take an author considerable time. With open access, all that goes away. So that's another area in which there is time saving. Not to mention the research practice areas of things like not being so likely to go up a blind alley because you didn't know that something had been published before that would have told you that was a blind alley, not duplicating work that's already been done because you didn't have access to the literature that told you about that. All those sorts of research practice reasons for open access also contribute to this efficiency saving that open access can bring. So now I'm just going to tell you a little bit about these individual studies and what they did. The first one, the CEPA study in 2008, modelled the situation for gold open access, that is open access through journals that require a payment at the front end. The author pays a certain amount of money to have their article processed by the publisher and published. And the CEPA study found these figures. I don't expect you to remember them, but they are quite big, and that's why I've put them in there. Globally, if we move to a gold open access system, then the costs of publication, distribution and access would fall by over 500 million British pounds per year. So it's probably something like 800 million US dollars. And also globally, there would be, they calculated that there would be considerable savings from just moving to electronic access only, i.e. getting rid of the print world and moving to just open access. That's just electronic access. That is, of course, part of open access. Open access is an electronic system, but it calculated what electronic access alone would contribute to the savings and calculated that the costs would fall by about £1 billion British pounds. So it's probably something like 1.5 billion US dollars. And in the UK, our academic libraries would save about 150 million British pounds per year. Again, that's probably something like 200 or 220 million US dollars. Now that's just for our 120-ish universities. Of course, if you're doing the sum in your head about how that would work out in the US, you're multiplying that up many, many times, and it's going to be a large sum which would be saved. So CEPA says through moving to gold open access. So that just shows those figures graphically. And again, as I said, I've put some of these slides in simply as a resource so that afterwards, if you want to plunder any of these for any data, they're here done for you ready. But don't forget that most of them are in British pounds. So if you're going to use them yourself, you'll have to do a little conversion there. So the Houghton studies, then, I want to move on to what he did, because he then started taking these efficiency savings into account. CEPA was just looking at the costs and cash flows. Houghton tried to measure or add into that calculation the value of all those efficiency savings that I mentioned in that when I was talking to that earlier slide. So what he did was he identified all the activities in the scholarly communication system, and he attached costs to each of those, mainly using the published literature mostly by Dong King and his associates. And therefore, he was able to cost out the entire scholarly communication system. And then he modeled the economic benefits of new and alternative scholarly communication scenarios. Now, I'll tell you which three he modeled in a minute. And he did it, as I've mentioned, first of all in his home country, Australia, and then in these other countries, in the UK, the Netherlands, Denmark, for the US federal agencies. That work was commissioned by Spark last year, and he's just this year going to publish a study which he's done for Germany as well. They're all coming out much the same, giving the same kind of message to policymakers and research funders. So there's complete consistency through those studies. And then I shall be telling you about that one that I did for the individual universities in the UK too. So the Houghton model, as we call it now, is available to download online. So you can take it from his website, and you can actually put your own data into that model and get the calculations done for your own university. And it models 3 alternative open access scenarios, plus it enables you to calculate the costs of various things that are going on in your university simply by putting various bits of data in that you have to collect. And it models an endpoint, and the endpoint is assumed to be in a completely open access world. It is not addressing transitions through to an open access world. It is modeling an endpoint which is in a world which is completely open access. Now, these 3 scenarios are as follows. First of all, there is self-archiving in repositories, the green route to open access. And there are 2 scenarios under this type of open access. First of all, there's the one that we live with at the moment, where repositories are collecting open access content in parallel with the continuing publication of journals which are sold on subscription to libraries. That is our situation at the moment. Sadly, repositories only have about 15 to 20% of the literature, not the 100% that we would like to see in them, but it is collecting in there, and we are still living in parallel with the subscription journal world. So that's our current scenario. Then there's another one, which is a little bit more futuristic, but nevertheless is kind of on its way, I think. And that is that we can take the subscription journals out of this picture, and we can imagine a world where repositories collect papers which are yet to be peer-reviewed. They are not publicly available when they haven't been peer-reviewed, but overlay services, that's what they tend to be called these days, overlay services, we can call them publishing services if you like. Once they know a paper is ready for publication and in a repository, can collect that paper, put it through the peer review process, just as a publisher does at the moment. And if it is deemed to be suitable for publication, they can then return it to the repository, having been peer reviewed, with some kind of a quality mark or stamp on that paper that says this is now peer reviewed, and it is then openly available. So that it's open access at that point. So effectively what we're talking about here is that the brand, if you like, moves from a journal to effectively the institution from which something is published. But the peer review is going on just as it does now, and it may well be that the current publishers are the ones still doing that process, still managing that process. But equally, we might think that new players might come into the game at this point and offer overlay services to manage that peer review. Either way, there will be a charge per article for that service, just as open access journals charge per article, and those charges may vary from one service to another. So we have to think of that kind of a world happening. And the other scenario, the third one, is open access journals, the gold ones that charge for publishing. Once an article has been peer reviewed and accepted, then a charge is levied for taking that paper through the copy editing and the quality control stuff done there and published in a journal. So they're the three scenarios that John Houghton modelled. And this table summarises what he found for the main countries that he's done so far. I've left out Australia because that's not probably so interesting to you as these others. So these sums here show what he's modelling suggests would be the annual savings, and here we're talking about the value in euros, which is not so far from the values in US dollars. The value in euros from those different scenarios, and you can see the scenarios in the different rows, and you can see the countries across the different columns. So that's quite a lot of money being saved per year in those different countries by a move to open access through these different ways of achieving it. The one that will be of most interest to you, of course, is the column on the right. And this is the work that Spark commissioned. They asked John to look at the value of the benefits for making the work funded by your federal agencies, your main federal agencies, the 11 biggest ones, in fact, publicly available as soon as it could be. And his modelling there calculated that the value of that benefit to US society amounts to some 4 to 25 times the cost of doing that. So there is a cost to doing this, but there is a massive societal benefit, and that has been a very influential finding, I understand, in political circles in the US and also amongst the funding agencies. So that's good news. So now I'm just going to run through what we found for the individual universities. And again, I hope this is of interest to you, because this is something that you can do for yourselves using that model. You do, however, have to collect quite a lot of data, but it is worth it to see what comes out at the other end. So what I did was I built on the work of John Houghton and did this analysis of the activities, attached the cost to those activities, and used his model to calculate the value of various things to do with scholarly communication, and then modelled the economic outcomes, the benefits, the economic benefits for 4 individual universities in the United Kingdom. And they varied in size, those universities, as I'll explain in a minute. If you want to do this yourself, the data that you need to collect for the modelling is of 3 types. First of all, there's data relating to your library. You need to collect things like the average salary of a librarian, the cost of subscriptions that you're paying at the moment, and those sorts of things. The number of articles published from your university, the number of journals bought, and so forth. There's research-related data, so you need to know how many researchers, active researchers, are in your institution, what their average salary is, and the approximate proportion of them who are serving on editorial boards or doing peer review. These things are perfectly possible to calculate, and I have a paper which describes how to collect these data. If anybody does want it, they can just email me afterwards and I'll provide it for them. And finally, there's data related to the repository. This is fairly easy to collect. It's just related to the costs of running the repository every year and how many papers it's collecting in it. So if you wanted to do that modeling, they're the areas that you have to focus on in terms of collecting data. Now, the reason for doing it for different universities is that they do all differ. You can't just do it for one and expect that to hold for others. You do things differently in your libraries. You buy your journals in different ways. Some of them are bought on big deals, all of them. Others may be bought with very few big deals being done. You run more or less elaborate repositories. You employ different numbers of people and you pay those people different salaries from one institution to another. All these things are going to be different, and many other things too that need to be taken into account. So that's why the modelling has to be done for different individual universities. And this graph just illustrates that point to you, that it can come out in an unexpected way, the modelling. So our universities that I did here, University A, B, C, and D, they go across from left to right there. And they go across from University A, which is a very tiny institution with a very small research budget, to University D, which is one of our big 5 elite universities, a very old and elite, world-renowned institution, which has a massive research budget. And yet, if you look at the library handling costs and the savings that you would get from moving to open access for those different universities, the modelling actually throws up something quite unexpected here, which is that although you might expect the smallest university to save the least, which is true, the next university in size, University B, is going to enjoy really huge savings. And University C, which is the next up in line, will enjoy something slightly less, and University D, the big one, slightly less. Now, you might intuitively expect that to work out differently, or for them all to go up in stepwise fashion, but it doesn't. And the reason is because the libraries do things differently, and therefore what they might save will vary from one university to another. So that's just illustrating the importance of doing it for an individual university and not looking at your neighbour and saying it worked out like that for them, I think it will work out like that for us too. It won't necessarily. So now, this slide shows the annual savings from open access with our 3 scenarios for the average university in the UK. And when I say average, it's not quite true. What I've taken here is the median values from my 4 universities. And you can see that they all enjoy saving, that it will enjoy savings from all the 3 scenarios for open access. Whatever one route we choose to get to open access, there's going to be some savings. The open access journal route doesn't look as if it's going to produce the same amount of savings as the repository related routes, but nevertheless there's savings there. And if we look at varying, this is for open access journals, the gold route. If we look at varying the article processing fee level, we see that the savings can be quite big if the article processing fee is low, that is the bar on the right-hand side. If the article processing fee is high, £2,000 British, which actually is not unknown in the present world, then the bar on the left shows that it will actually cost more for the university to pay for that route to open access than the current system that it's paying for through subscriptions, even with the efficiency savings from open access. And we get the same, well, we get a similar kind of picture for repositories. The bar on the left shows our current state of affairs, which is the repositories operating in parallel with subscription-based journals. There's still a saving there, but there are bigger savings with the overlay services route to open access, working on repositories, doing the peer review and returning the peer-reviewed material to the repository. And as the article processing fee for that overlay service gets less as we move towards the right-hand side of the graph, then the savings become bigger and bigger. This is all fairly simple stuff, but it's nice to have it shown graphically, I think, there. And this just shows for our 4 universities the savings from open access through repositories. And of course, well, not of course, but as it happened, it worked out that that would be a cheaper route. There would be savings all round. Whatever the size of the university, this would be a cheaper way to get to open access. And with journals, it's cheaper for the smaller universities, but not necessarily so for the larger ones, because they're publishing a lot of material and they're paying an article processing fee for each article published. If you want to download the model and use it yourself, that URL, or these URLs, are where to go for the model, and you can take it and put your own data in and get these kinds of graphs out for yourself. So finally, just coming to the recently published reports. First of all, the CEPA one, that's just been out for a couple of weeks now. It was done in the UK, and this did look at a transition scenario. It looked at moving towards open access over a 5-year period, and it actually looked at a number of scenarios, just as John Houghton did. It looked at green open access through repositories, but be aware that it did not look at the overlay route here. It just looked at our current parallel route, where we've still got subscription journals, but we do provide open access in parallel through repositories, gold open access through journals, and then 2 particularly UK things, and having a national license for our higher education institutions and having a national license for our National Health Service. They are not of relevance to you, but I put those points in there because they appear on a graph I'm going to show you in a minute, and I wanted you to understand what they were. And then they calculated, amongst other things, the benefit cost ratios for each of those scenarios. And this is the graph, and the 3 things that you need to look at are the ones towards the left. On the very left, we have the green scenario, which has a positive benefit cost ratio. In fact, they all have positive ones, but that has quite a good one. The gold scenario has a positive one, but not quite a good one when we're looking at higher article processing costs. But the middle line, the middle value there, shows the gold scenario modeled with a lower article processing fee. And if they did that, then they found that there was a considerable benefit compared to the cost of that system. And so actually their conclusions and recommendations were that the government in the UK should encourage the use of the current, what they called green OA infrastructure. That is our network of repositories. All our universities have them now, and all are collecting open access material. But they said to be cautious about pushing for reductions in embargo periods because that might undermine the current publishing model. My answer to that would be that that is exactly what we are trying to do with open access. We are trying to change the publishing model, and therefore we don't necessarily wish to have that persisting forever in the way it's doing now. But that in parallel, the government or our big national funders should consider helping a transition to gold open access by helping that money move to the authors so that they can pay open access fees, providing the level of article processing fees remains below 2,000 British pounds. If it goes above that, then the benefit cost ratio is considerably lowered. And now finally, this is just my last point, this is the benefits, economic benefits to other constituencies of open access. And this is work which, as I said, was published this week. It was published by the Danish government, but it was carried out by us and John Houghton. We worked together on this. And we looked, the Danish government commissioned us to look at the economic benefits to Danish innovative businesses from open access. Now, the Houghton model calculates something called return to research. And if you use it, you will find the value of this item for your own university. It's a measure in non-economist terms, so I'm not an economist, so this is how I define it. It's a measure of the benefit to the constituencies in society that can access and use scientific information or the research information. It is a measure of the benefit to them, the value of the benefit to them. We forget these people. They are those ones I've put up there: family doctors, lawyers, things like civil engineering companies, there are horticulturalists, plant breeders, there are independent consultants like me, all sorts of people in society, including innovative small businesses, can and wish to use the research literature, and can't really do that very well because we don't have subscriptions and the cost of accessing individual articles is very high. So there is a return to research from open access, and it is the research done by people outside of the academic community. And what we did was we studied research and development-based small companies in Denmark, a whole list of companies provided by the Danish Ministry for Science and Innovation. And we did this by means of interviews and of an online questionnaire. And we came up with the following results. First of all, we found that 48% of small Danish innovative companies consider that access to research articles is very or extremely important, and yet 79% of those companies have access difficulties. Searching, we were able to, because we asked them questions about the value of their company and what they spent on research and what they got in sales and so forth, we were able to identify various values here. And searching and accessing articles costs these companies 52 million, about 52 million euros per year. And these are just Danish firms. Denmark is a very small company with a small innovative sector. So you can imagine how this might translate into a larger European country or the US. They told us that product development would be delayed or abandoned without access to research articles. So it's very important that they do get it. And we were able to calculate from the figures they gave us that the value of access to academic research to their sales is around 2.1 million euros per firm per year, and that the value of delays to those companies in accessing the research is nearly 500 million euros per firm per year. So that's a lot of money for each firm. In terms of the Danish economy, which of course we did extrapolate to, then that comes to a big figure, and it will come to a much bigger figure in the US, of course. So that was lots of figures. I'm finishing now, and that's lots of figures, and I'm very sorry for that. But so I'm going to summarize with these few points. First of all, open access by any route, green or gold, will be cheaper, as well as being much more efficient and more efficacious. Most universities would see savings, and if the article processing fee is pitched at the right level, all of them would see savings from whatever scenario. And yes, there is a discussion to be had about what I've called the money go round, how we move money around the system from our present way of paying for access, which is through subscriptions, to moving it to the front end of the process so that there's payment for publication effectively. Yes, there is that discussion, but it is important to have it. It's important to get to an open access world, because not only would academic research benefit, but the rest of society would also benefit economically, scientifically, and culturally. So that's it. Thank you for listening. If you want to email me, you can do so at that address, or you can do it through our website too. And Well, that's it. So, Martin, would you like to take some questions here? I think I put one more slide in. Oh, yes. Again, I thought I'd leave that up while the questions went on in case anyone wants to take down those or that first URL. The first one's enough because you can just scroll down the page and find the US institutional model that we developed there.
Lovely. Can you hear us, Alma?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly, yeah.
That all went off perfectly.
Okay, good old Skype.
We can transition now to Q&A, and while we're transitioning on the image, let me tell you what we're going to do. We're going to try and see if we can work the camera on our end so we can at least direct it to the part of the room where the question is coming from as we hand the microphone off to questioners. And I'll actually start with a question that your talk was very provocative. Thank you. A two-part question.
Do you like my screensaver, Martin?
Yes. I'm sorry?
That's all right. So I was just saying, do you like my screensaver? There we are. Ah, right. There you are.
That's me.
Yes, I'm going to stop sharing the screen.
And we see your pandas. My daughter would be very happy. She loves panda bears. So, while we're and you're going to send, there comes your video. Okay.
Yeah.
Can you highlight the differences, because I'm not quite clear about it, or the assumptions underlying in those analyses of the green model and the overlay model? I just wanted to make sure I understood the distinctions between those two.
Okay. The green model is where we have a network of repositories. Each institution is collecting the material that is published from that institution, even though it is being published in journals. So it's what we're living with at the moment. A researcher gets a paper ready, they submit it to a journal, the journal accepts it, and then what should happen, of course, as well, if people would only do what we tell them, is that that researcher would also put a copy of that paper in their institutional repository. So the journal is publishing it in the journal, the open access copy is provided through the institutional repository. That's what we call plain green, and that's where we are at the moment. As I said, we have about 15% of research in repositories, and it would be nice to have that being 95% instead of 15, but still, we're getting there slowly. The green route with the overlay is where this is futuristic. I did say that. So we're not living with this really at the moment, though we have something which is quite similar, which I'll tell you about. But anyway, what it is each university has a repository, which it does have at the moment, or should have. Instead of the researcher publishing in a journal, he or she will get the paper ready for publication and then put it in the repository in a dark area of the repository. Okay? So it's not open access before it's been peer reviewed. Once it's in the repository, by some means, the overlay service or publishing service, whatever we want to call it, is notified, given an accession number or URL or URI or something. The publishing service collects the paper, takes it through 2 quality control steps. One is the peer review, as usual, and the second one is the copy editing or proofreading, editorial quality control, let's call that. That's what publishers do, those 2 quality control steps. They would still be doing it, or somebody would be doing it. I can't imagine Elsevier being that keen on this, but I can imagine learned society publishers seeing that they have a role and a place in this scenario. So they do that. Once it's been peer reviewed and is ready for publishing, it goes back to the repository with and then it's opened up. So it has been peer reviewed, and the metadata will indicate that it's been peer reviewed. Now, we don't have quite that at the moment, but what we do have is the archive working in quite a similar way. So the physics archive people do put non-peer-reviewed papers in there. They put preprints in there. And at least two learned societies, the Institute of Physics Publishing here in the UK and the European Physical Society, and I think to the American Physical Society, are perfectly happy for an author to put their preprint into archive and give them the accession number and say, I'd like this to go, I'm submitting this effectively to, you know, your journal of blah, 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 whatever. And those societies then go in, they take that paper out using the accession number to identify it. They then take it through those quality control steps and they publish it in a journal. So they're still publishing in the journal, not returning it to archive peer review. So that is the other difference. But it is a kind of indication that this system could work practically, and it could work using learned societies.
Okay, we have a question over here.
Hi, Alma.
Hi.
It's John Walensky here.
Hi, John.
Hi. I wanted to discuss a bit about the
Where
article.
are you? Oh, yes, there you are. Hello.
The article processing fee.
Yeah.
It is going to be a big challenge because there's such a diversity between the majority of open access journals that have a zero article processing fee and those that are hovering a good number of the commercial publishers at $3,000.
Yes.
So it raises two questions. One raises two issues, perhaps. One is we could calculate, based on the proportion of the literature that is now at the $3,000 mark, and the proportion that in the social sciences and humanities is at the $0 mark. Yep. So we could come up with something other than a kind of that scale that you presented. And the other is we need a way of exposing and drawing more attention to the discrepancies, because many of us hold that an article in a philosophy journal at zero article processing fees has as much to contribute to knowledge as a $3,000 philosophy article in an Elsevier journal or a Springer Open or whatever. So has any consideration, first of all, been given to doing a count based on the current distribution of non-fees and fees?
No, but it's perfectly easy to do that in John Houghton's model. And it is a point that I wanted to make to people, that if you are going to use that model yourselves, and I have done this with it, although I haven't published all these different perms and cons of the situation, but you can take that model and you can pretend that there are no article processing fees when you're modeling the gold situation, or you can pretend that only half of the papers charge them, half of the journals charge them, or you can say, for my university, I think that half of the papers published in this university are written with co-authors from another university who might themselves pay the article processing fees. So in other words, we're only paying for half the outputs from this particular institution. You can model all those different scenarios. Right. And so you can play around with it. John has done that, and I have done it, but I haven't published it. I've just done it for my own private information.
I'm only concerned, Alma, that with the majority of open access journals today not using article processing fees, that models like John's are affirming the fact that those are the norm, that article processing fees are the norm, and that we had better get used to them. And I do know from the experience with open journal systems, with the system that I work with, we did a survey of 1,000 journals, and they were not charging article processing fees. 80% of them were not charging article processing fees. Some were actually subscription journals. And of that 80%, we did an average of their costs, not what they were charging, and it was coming in at under $200 US per article. Yeah. And so I'm just concerned that we don't create a expectation or treat as a norm that there will be and must be article processing fees, because it discounts the volunteer efforts of so many editors and reviewers and copy editors that are currently sustaining humanities and social science journals.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, John. And that is, well, there's two things I want to say to that. First of all, it echoes and reinforces what I said about modeling individual situations, because that will vary from university to university apart from anything else. But secondly, John Houghton did address this point in his big study, And what he said on that was, I know that more than half, something like 56% or something of journals don't charge article processing fees. I know that, but there is a cost in the system to producing those journals. And it is exactly what you have just identified, the cost of the voluntary labor. It is voluntary, but somebody is paying those people. And so he acknowledged that and said, I know that's going on, and so I am going to kind of mentally say that the cost of those free ones is still matching the cost of the ones where the charge is levied. I do take your point, and I think it is very important that we don't tar everybody with the same $3,000 brush, because that's ridiculous. What I do think is useful, however, about these studies is that it makes the point that article processing fees can only be borne to a certain level. And it has emphasized over here, certainly in the UK, to our research funders, that they need to be thinking about making some kind of a limit to how much they will pay towards publication fees. And my hope, therefore, is that where they are levied, there will be downward pressure from the market on the level of those fees, because clearly we cannot support a system where we get Elsevier level and Springer level fees for all journals. That is just unsupportable. So I rather like the implications of these modelling studies. The implication is that article processing fees should be, and can be, hopefully, driven downwards by market forces, even in the areas where they have to be charged by commercial publishers. That is not to denigrate in any way or even minimize what you're saying about the social sciences and humanities, where I know lots and lots and lots of journals are published effectively for nothing by good people giving of their time.
This is Martin.
Nice to see you there.
Do we have any additional questions? I have maybe a wrap-up question, and you may have already answered it, Alma. Is the assumption in the gold models that you presented that all, I very much agree with John's point that questioning that assumption about the sort of the $3,000 level of those things. But apart from that point, is the assumption in the gold models that all of the costs, if there are, significant, sort of page charges or deposit or publishing charges, that they're borne by the institution, the university, as opposed to perhaps research funds that are received from federally granted agencies or other sources, to sort of balance the overhead of supporting the system?
Okay, well, what I presented to you, those graphs assumed that the university itself was paying, and it was paying for every paper published from it. But what you can do, using the model yourself, anyone can do this, is to say, as I said, I think we'd only be paying for about half the papers published from here, because half will be paid by another institution, or half might be paid for by research funding money coming in from government contracts and things like that. So you can just fiddle around with what data you plug into the model. I gave the worst case scenario effectively there, and assumed that the university would pay for everything itself. But that clearly is not real life. It's not real life. And so for each individual institution, some kind of estimate has to be made about how that should be handled. The other thing I would say is, going back a bit to, it's talking to you and John here really, is that the conclusions that I drew from our modelling of institutions was that we could support open access through a kind of pay to publish model, either of them, if the fee there's a kind of break-even point at around 750 UK pounds. And I pulled that out of the modelling because I wanted that in the public domain as a figure that people discussed. That gives a benchmark to publishers and says, you know, $3,000, the £2,000 fee is just not a sustainable thing. If you bring it down like Hindawi does to something entirely reasonable, like 500 British pounds or less, then that's fine. We've got the money now, and we can find a way to move that about. So,
very, very provocative. Are there any final questions for Alma? Well, please join me in thanking Alma Swan. Thank you, Alma. I guess we'll sign off with you now, and thank you again for joining us over this teleconferencing solution.
It's been great. Thank you. I hope the rest of your day goes very well. Thank you.
Good.
Thanks for having me. Okay. Bye.
All right. So we will transition now just a bit in terms of the technology, and be introducing our next speaker just momentarily. Bill will be introducing the next speaker.